Hey folks, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the trial of Sarah Boone. After 5 years, 9 lawyers, and 1 lost Dr. Pepper, the trial is finally underway. It kicked off yesterday on Friday. Both sides gave their opening statement, and the state started calling their first couple witnesses. Sarah ended up with a full team of private sector lawyers. We'll talk about how that came about. But Sarah's feeling good. She's got her new team of lawyers. She's feeling confident. They're snickering about things. They're fist bumping at moments. They're thinking we're really just going to blow this whole thing up. Looking at Sarah sitting there at her table, I've been thinking this during the whole pre-trial and everything. I can't believe how bad she looks and how bad she's aged in these 5 years. She was arrested in her mid-40s, and now she looks like a 63-year-old woman that took care of herself. Like if I wasn't paying attention and had no idea who Sarah was, and someone walked up and handed me a recent picture of her and said, "This woman is 63, but she always ate vegetables and got a lot of sleep," I would say, nice, good for her, that's awesome. I wouldn't say, yeah, right, why are you trying to trick me? This woman's in her late 40s. What are you doing? I would say, no, and a lot of the times when someone is living the way Sarah is living and getting blackout drunk every day and chain smoking cigarettes, and then they get arrested and they go to jail and they're forced to sober up, a lot of the times the next time you see them, they look way better and they put a little weight on and their skin is better and their hair is thicker. Sarah, when she was arrested, she looked like a little unhinged torture goblin from hell. So I was thinking, all right, the next time we see her, she's probably going to look filled out and look better. And then the next time you see her, it's like, she skipped her 50s looks-wise. How did that happen? And she's wearing a blazer over a blouse, like a pink blouse with a blazer over it. That's her court. And for some reason, I'm looking at her with her hair and that blazer, and the vibes that she gives me, her new look, the vibes she gives me is an evil, strict elementary school principal that all the children are terrified of, Miss Boone. And they tell their parents, no, she's awful, we're terrified of her. And the parents say, nah, you gotta respect her. She's the principal, she's in charge. And then one late night, the janitor, who's all alone in the whole school, he's cleaning Sarah's office, and he's vacuuming, and he's listening to music in his headphones and doing the trash. And then he notices, wait a second, the wall on that side of the bookshelf isn't the same size as the wall on this side of the bookshelf. And then he looks, the thick wood bookshelf, it almost looks like there's a space behind it. What the hell? And then after a few minutes of tinkering with the bookshelf, he realizes the bookshelf is a secret door, and he figures out how to open it, and behind it, he finds a bunch of child-sized skeletons. That's the vibes I get from looking at Sarah sitting there at the table. But anywho, I think the funniest, most interesting moment that's happened with this whole thing so far actually happened 3 days ago, 2 days before the actual trial starts, when they were doing pre-trial motions. So let me set up this moment. So in order to go with, Sarah's side has made it very clear they're going with self-defense, battered spouse syndrome. And so how you use battered spouse syndrome as a defense is you hire a battered spouse expert, which they did, Dr. Harper. Then the next step is the defendant, in this case Sarah, meets with the newly hired expert and tells them the story. And why that's so interesting is because because of this, get to hear Sarah's new story even before she gets up on the stand. You got to think in the next couple weeks. And why we get to hear it is because when the defendant meets with the new expert, the prosecutor is allowed to be there, which he was. So the prosecutor got to hear Sarah talk with this new expert about why it actually is self-defense. Everybody remembers at the right when it happened, she was going with not intentional. It was a good day, no malicious. Well, now they're going with, well, you know what? It was intentional. It was self-defense, intentional. And so Sarah's had 5 years to sit in her jail cell and think of this new story. And so she meets with the new expert. The prosecutor gets to be there and listen in on it. And then that happens. And then 3 days ago, the prosecutor filed a motion basically saying, we were there. Well, she told her new story to Dr. Harper, the expert. We heard the new story. In her new story, it's lacking an overt act that allows her then to be able to use self-defense and kill him. Every self-defense case, there has to be an overt act by the person that ends up getting killed. Did they pull out a gun and point it at you? Did they come at you with a giant knife? Were they strangling you? Did they kick the door in of your house and start hurting your family? What was the overt act that makes it acceptable for you to defend yourself and kill them? Well, the prosecutor files a motion that says, Your Honor, we heard her new story because she told the expert. You got to think it's probably going to be the same story that she tells up on the stand, because it would be a pretty bad look as if she tells the story right after it happened and then now is saying, no, actually, this is what happened to the expert. And then in theory, she could change it one more time up on the stand. Actually, this is what happened, but that's a terrible look. And why would you lie to your hired expert? That story that you tell the expert, that's what the expert is going to analyze and filter through their expertise and then get up on the stand and say, this is why this actually does meet the criteria for battered spouse. But anyway, 3 days ago, during the pretrial motions, the prosecutor said, Your Honor, I heard the new story that Sarah's going with, and that new story is, which I thought this was really interesting, that they said they're hanging out, they're having a good day, and then they said, Tag, you're it. This isn't new yet, but still. It said, Tag, you're it. Sarah runs up to the bathroom, hides in the shower, and she says that George gets in the suitcase himself. Then Sarah says she gets cold standing in the shower, which her story before years ago was she got bored. So she had a funny thing where she goes, I was in the shower, and then I got bored being in the frickin' shower. But now her new story is she got cold in the shower, hiding. So just pictures Sarah in the shower. According to Sarah, George has gotten in the suitcase by himself. So George is in the suitcase. Sarah is standing in the shower. After a time, Sarah gets a little cold standing in the shower. So then she says, she goes down, and George is hiding in the suitcase with it unzipped. In a playful, funny way, Sarah came up and zipped up the suitcase. Just all fun and games still. And then Sarah said that after a bit of being zipped in the suitcase, which I think is understandable, George wanted out. And the reason he said he wanted out was because he said he couldn't breathe. According to Sarah's new story that she's telling the expert that the prosecution is listening in on, George saying, I cannot breathe, triggered Sarah and enraged her, triggered past events, nothing that happened that day, past events of their relationship, and him saying that, I can't breathe, made her go into a terrible rage. At that point, she tells the expert, the prosecutor's listening, that she violently flipped the suitcase over, flipped it upside down. One of the witnesses that did take the stand yesterday from the prosecution was the neighbor, and he testified that he was sitting in his room on the fateful night, and he heard a tremendous thud that sounded like it started far away and then ended up right next to him and shook the whole wall. So I think it's safe to say that Sarah pushed the suitcase down the stairs, and then it gets really bad. Sarah says she had a baseball bat and was whacking the suitcase with the baseball bat. This is probably all the head injuries that George came back with and everything. And then this is where it gets very stupid. The self-defense part, because as of right now, there's no part of it that makes it self-defense, right? And then so at that moment, Sarah said, then his hand started, like a couple fingers made it out of the space in the zipper, and his hand started to come out and to move the zipper. And at that point, she took the baseball bat and just started hitting the hands his hands that were trying to get out of the zipper, because she knew if he got out, I guess, that he would kill her. And that's the story. Then she was drunk, and she felt like she had a captive audience. That's what they're going with for the videos, is she finally had a captive audience while he was locked in the suitcase, and she could say whatever she wanted to say to him. For everything he's done to me. For everything you've done to me. Okay, so anyway, Sarah meets with the new expert. I don't know if this is a month ago or a couple weeks ago, but she tells the new story and the prosecutor listens to it. And then, like I said, a couple days ago, the prosecutor says, Your Honor, in Sarah's new story, which is what I just told, it's lacking the overt act that makes it acceptable for her to defend herself and kill George. And so until there is an overt act, which that story, which he actually summarized the story just like I did, just went through it. So unless I'm missing something and there's more to the story, that story is lacking the overt act. So I would like to file a motion that Sarah's side is not allowed to bring up battered spouse, self-defense, do any reputation stuff about George, saying, yeah, he's so violent and all of this past stuff. You can't bring up anything and assassinate his reputation. What was the other ones? Basically bring up anything about battered spouse, his reputation, past acts of violence that happened between him, any of that, until you officially establish what is the overt act that made it acceptable for him to defend herself, to defend himself and kill him. And so that was the motion that he put in. And then the judge says to her defense attorneys, her new team of attorneys, okay, what's the overt act? That's a decent point. Before you can start assassinating his reputation and his character and talking about how bad of a guy he was and bringing up experts about battered spouse, you have to establish the overt act. And going into this whole trial, I was thinking, if she goes with self-defense, whether it's her or her new team of lawyers, someone at some point is going to look like a dumbass, because it really is the dumbest attempt at self-defense I've ever seen or heard. And so I'm thinking either it's Sarah trying to claim self-defense or looking like a dumbass, or it's going to be her lawyer. Just because it's a private sector lawyer doesn't make a bad idea smart. Just because you're a lawyer, oh my God, a private sector lawyer, what are we going to do? And so I was sitting back thinking, at some point, if they go with self-defense, someone is going to look like a dumbass. And I was waiting for that moment, and this is that moment. Her lawyer, or it was actually one of her assistant lawyers, getting up and arguing against that motion that they shouldn't be allowed to talk about any of that stuff until they establish the overt act. And this is what he said. So one of her lawyers gets up, and he's not happy because they don't want to give up their strategy of what they think the overt act is in pretrial, because then the prosecution knows what it is. They can focus in on that moment and be prepared for it. So one of her defense lawyers gets up, and he's not happy that he is being forced in pretrial to give up what they think is their official overt act that allows it to be self-defense. So he's going, see, well, now I'm being forced to give our overt act before the even trial starts, basically saying give up our strategy, and he's not happy about it. And finally he says, the overt act, I have to tell you, his hand coming out of the suitcase. That means he's about to get out of the suitcase. Now, based on history and everything else, she doesn't have to wait to see what's going to happen when he gets out. It's clear what's going to happen when he gets out of the suitcase. This is where it starts to get really dumb. It's followed up by physical evidence, because there's a picture provided of Mr. Torres's hand that shows a mark on the hand that matches up with the bat. That's the overt act. It's like a gun, okay? You don't have to wait for them to pull the trigger. You don't. And it's based on all the evidence in the case, just not testimony, but also physical evidence that might support the testimony. So as I was watching this as of like a month ago, saying, if you go with self-defense, at some point you're just going to look utterly stupid. And now here it is. Him saying the overt act is his hand coming out of the suitcase. So she locks him in the suitcase. He begs for minute after minute, please help me. I can't breathe. I need to get out. She tells him, that's my name. Don't wear it out. That sounds like your problem. So she's not, when it's clear that she's not going to help him and he's in big trouble and he's upside down, he has positional asphyxiation is setting in. He probably already has a concussion. And then when he knows, all right, well, she's not going to help me. I can't believe it. She's not going to help me. When he starts to save himself by trying to get his hand out and open the zipper, then she hits the hand with the baseball bat, and they're evidence of this is self-defense, because if you look at his hand, he has a mark that's the same as a baseball bat. So her hitting him with the baseball bat is what really kicks off the self-defense. And then my favorite part is, it's like a gun. It's like a gun, okay? You don't have to wait for them to pull the trigger. You don't. How is not having a gun like having a gun? Not having a gun is nothing like having a gun. If he would have come out with a gun, all right, well, a hand that's not holding a gun is nothing like a hand that's holding a gun. And so, as you can see, her side really doesn't have much for the overt act. If just the hand of a person trying to do everything they can to save themselves is the overt act, and it didn't play, the judge said, all right, that's not enough of an overt act. So they're still, as of right now, missing the overt act. So the motion from the prosecution got granted. They're not allowed to mention. They could in the opening statements, but now that the opening statements are over, until they establish the overt act, they can't call up any battered spouse or self-defense witnesses. They can't talk about George's reputation and character. And his reputation and character are the whole thing, right? They got to paint him as such an awful person that what he went through was bad enough to be self-defense for Sarah. And when in reality, if George would have gotten himself out and picked up Sarah and choke slammed her on her head right there, that would probably be closer to self-defense than what Sarah's team of lawyers is going with. And so now we're going through the state's case right now. Pretty much everything other than the neighbors that testified, it sounded like she pushed him down the stairs. It's just been Sarah's husband or ex-husband saying he told her to call 911 3 times before she did. They did the 911 operator and they listened to the 911 call. I've talked about that on my show. And they've done the body cam footage, which I'm sure everybody watching this has seen. So the state's plugging along. Not much, if you followed this whole thing, not much that you haven't seen. And then it's going to get really interesting when the defense takes over, because if they have to establish that overt act before they can get into anything else that they want to talk about, and the only person that can establish the overt act is Sarah by getting up on the stand and telling the story, you got to think Sarah's going to be one of their first witnesses. You're going to bring her up. She's going to tell her story, try to establish the overt act as hard as she can, and then once she's off the stand, that's when you call the experts and you start talking about how awful George was and that he deserved it, and it's not going to be a great look. Last thing I want to talk about is, so the prosecutor, when he was filing that motion of they shouldn't be able to talk about self-defense until they establish the overt act, one of the things that, oh no, did I just forget what I was going to say? Shoot. Well, maybe I'll think of it. A couple other things that have happened is Sarah's side has gotten a few of they wanted the whole interrogation. Sarah's side wanted the whole interrogation to be suppressed, can't use it as evidence, saying she got tricked into giving that interrogation and they didn't read her Miranda rights quite right and everything, and that one got thrown out. But a few of the statements from the interrogators saying, like, you did this, you caused this, were a little bit too much, so those are going to be redacted. Nothing too crazy about that. And then Sarah's side also got called out during pretrial because they were trying to just dump as many irrelevant records on the prosecution as possible, so they'd get 500 pages of irrelevant medical records from Sarah and then just send them over to the prosecution. Well, when you get 500 pages as a prosecution, you got to go over the whole thing, make sure there's nothing important in there or anything. And Sarah's side got kind of called out on, they had sent like a bunch of pages of some records and then later sent what they said was the same, but it was a bunch of different. So the prosecution is going, listen, they sent all of these records saying they're the same as that batch. They're not the same. It's taken forever to go through them. It's starting to look like a strategy. And then they had to have what's called a Richardson hearing, which the judge looks at the way and the manner that the defense is sending all of the records and papers and everything over to the prosecution and has to decide, are they trying to play games to the point where it's going to hinder the defense's strategy, or going to hinder the prosecution's ability to make a case? Are you just bogging them down with nonsense for no reason? You're not allowed to do that. And so there had to be a Richardson hearing, and they decided it wasn't quite bad enough to delay the trial or anything. But the last thing, I remember what I wanted to say. So the prosecutor, when he was putting in that motion, they shouldn't be able to talk about any of this stuff. He said that this is her new story. In theory, she could change her story up on the stand again. It would be a really bad look, because how many story changes can you possibly do before no one believes you ever again? But I think she has to, and I think she's going to, because she probably didn't even understand what an overt act and how important it was to a self-defense until she sat there 3 days ago and listened to all the lawyers talk about it and discuss it and hear how important it is. And so now she's almost forced to, because there really isn't an overt act in the story now that she's going with. So somehow Boone, up on the stand, which is going to be first couple witnesses the defense calls, is going to have to stick with the story that she gave the expert, but then somehow, some way, insert a believable overt act that allows her to then use self-defense. That's the most interesting thing happening with the whole thing so far. I'm going to cut it off there. See you next time. Why? Steven, why? Sha.